Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 4 of our What If series, a chance to explore the ideas from PJI's publication, What If? 10 Questions to Spark Pretrial Change. I'm Megan Guevara, and I'm joined today by my partner, Tennille Patterson. And today we're going to be talking about what if we had more options than 911, which I know is a hot topic in many of your communities. So we welcome hello and comments in the chat from those of you who are joining us today. And in a few minutes, we'll also be joined by our guest, Liz Swavola, who's the director of the Triage Response Team at the Center for Policing Equity, who's going to be weighing in on our conversation as well. But for now, we'll jump in to talk about 911 and what if we had some other options?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. So glad to be here again for another conversation that's intended to spark change and spark conversations for all of you whom joined us today. The role of police has become, one of a catch-all in our society for all of our problems. And 911, which is how most residents have access to the police, really has become the default for any type of emergency. Here at the Pretrial Justice Institute, we believe that interaction with law enforcement is a significant driver of mass incarceration because that is the point of arrest. And we know that any significant interventions that are designed to support pretrial justice have to include a reduction in contact with law enforcement. And then if we're talking about equity-centered interventions, we have to pay special attention to 911 because it has a racialized history in our country with its origins during the civil rights movement.
Yeah, deflecting people is definitely one of the best tools we have, both for keeping people out of the pretrial process in the first place, as well as creating opportunities to address some of the root problems that we know are not best addressed by the criminal legal system, but the criminal legal system has become the default for addressing those concerns. The thousands of people with mental health issues, with substance use disorders, who are unhoused, who are coming into our systems every year, need another option. And fortunately, more places are recognizing that some other structure needs to be created or needs to be reinforced for that to happen. And we're seeing these 911 alternatives programs pop up across the country. The biggest example that we all have our fingers crossed for right now is the 988 system, the national number that allows people who are in crisis to be able to make a phone call and get connected to services. But we're still looking to see what the results of that are going to be and know that the array of services that are available to support 988 varies across the country. And that a lot of our colleagues are very much involved in pushing for the development of those resources. And we also see both civilian responder models, like here in Denver. We have a civilian responder program that thus far has been very successful and is expanding, where law enforcement are not involved in responding to certain calls that are made related to people in crisis, as well as civilian and law enforcement co-responder models. That on the one hand have shown a lot of promise and have a lot of good outcome data related to them over the past several years, but also programs like the LEAD program are recognizing that there's also space for law enforcement to step back in those models. And we know that when people in crisis come in contact with law enforcement, that there's the potential for danger, that there's the potential for violence. And unfortunately, we've also seen that here in the Denver area with the death of Elijah McClain and the continuing conversations we're having locally about what that means for how law enforcement or anyone should be responding to folks with mental health needs. So today we really want to be thinking about what are the implications of those different types of approaches, both for being able to move people out of the pretrial process and also for centering equity and what that is going to look like moving forward. And we also need to consider the question that for deflection programs to be successful, it means that other types of interventions need to be really well resourced. And if we're not able to bolster our public health systems, our mental health systems, and do that in a way that's equitable as well, then having another number to call ultimately is not going to help break the cycle of folks who are in crisis continuing to be involved with law enforcement. Seeing a lot of comments in the chat about that as well. Law enforcement are not mental health clinicians, are not trained to be so. And it's really important that we connect people with the services that are most necessary for them.
Yeah, we've been speaking a lot this week about values and what happens when you center values. And for folks that have had an opportunity to read our What If document, you know that that's a central focus of what happens when you center equity. And so when we think about these deflection programs, even though well-intentioned, we still need to be cautious about the racial disparities in the way they've been utilized. We know that informal deflection has been around for decades, right? So, if not centuries, where typically in white and affluent communities, if someone were to come into contact with police, then that police would often call a family member, no arrest would be made, and so that person would essentially be informally deflected from the system. We also know that oftentimes in these communities, as Megan, you mentioned, the other resources are actually available. There are places to be deflected to. There are treatment services. And so if these opportunities are made available disproportionately, then we know that the alternatives actually may exacerbate racial disparities. We know that without an equity focus, that we can almost be confident that racial disparities will still exist, that we have to use equity as the lens. And then we also need to consider the geographical implications of these programs, right? So how do we make them more universally available to avoid justice by geography? So if you're in one city or jurisdiction, just a mile outside of another, you may have very different outcomes in terms of being deflected, as well as having access to those resources. And I think all of this conversation reminds us again that when we think about public safety, we have to center equity and we have to call on new ways of thinking about how do we actually provide the things that our community needs.
Mhm. And that's a good segue to invite Liz Swavola to join us, who's here from the Center for Policing Equity, one of the many organizations that's also considering these questions of what are the alternatives that are available to 911. And Liz, at the Center for Policing Equity, your North Star is protecting, empowering, and supporting vulnerable communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, to redesign their public safety systems. And would love to hear from you why reducing the footprint of policing is part of achieving that vision.
Thanks so much, Megan and Tennille, and thanks for having me here. It's so great to be in space with both of you. Well, first, I think most of us can agree that police departments and law enforcement agencies are not equipped to reverse the damage of chronic disinvestment in Brown and Black communities and most impacted communities. An armed response is certainly not what social issues require. And far too often, police are called to crises that others would be better able to address, such as mental health crises and lack of housing. And as you touched on, this dynamic can lead to people not only needlessly entering the criminal legal system, but more tragic outcomes. For example, dozens of people considering suicide are killed every year by officers who are sent in theory to help them. And at CPE, we center Black and Brown communities in that vision because they are most impacted and have been most impacted by this kind of burdensome policing.
Yeah, we also know that CPE uses data, right, and data science to identify racially disparate policing outcomes and their drivers in an attempt to help vulnerable communities design more equitable public safety systems. And we know that contact with law enforcement contributes to racial disparities in the criminal legal system, and that civilian deflection models can really prevent that contact. What do you see as the equity implications of shrinking law enforcement's footprint in favor of other types of responses? And then as a secondary question, do you see the potential for any unintended consequences?
Yeah, I'll start with the second part of your question. And I think you really beautifully touched on it in your overview that in efforts to reduce the footprint of law enforcement, we need to bring a very intentional equity lens to that effort. Otherwise, as you said, the disparities may persist or they may deepen. And we've probably all seen examples of well-intentioned reforms that ultimately ended up serving white communities more than Black and Brown communities. We've probably seen community centers that get built in a space that is not safe or accessible for Black and Brown folks. And that's probably because they were not consulted in the process of building that resource. We also saw it during the height of the pandemic, efforts to divert people away from the criminal legal system for safety reasons ultimately benefited white people to a greater extent. And we saw those disparities deepen. So I think the primary goal really has to be reducing policing of Black and Brown communities, because that's really where the history of harm is. And by reducing the footprint of policing, that also allows resources to be better aligned with community-led solutions.
That's a great point about community really needing to be the driver for what are the solutions that are necessary. And we've had a few comments and questions in the chat box related to, making the distinction between, how do you know what is the right response? And the opportunity to really default to a supportive response versus a law enforcement response is a significant change in our mindset of how we deal with crisis in our community. And is it that you have to make the case for an alternative, or that you'd have to make the case for a law enforcement response? And one of the things that we at PJI love about CPE's materials, and specifically your roadmap for exploring new models of funding public safety, is that you do take that broad view of what safety is and what are the range of services that are needed to achieve that goal. And the roadmap stresses that we need to reevaluate current investments in public safety and shift how resources are being used. And would love to hear some more about why that fiscal analysis is critical to the success of civilian deflection programs.
Yeah, absolutely. So evaluating what the footprint of policing currently looks like is really key to understanding how those resources are being allocated. So you can ask questions like, why are people calling 911? And how are officers spending their time? And are there differences in response times by neighborhood? And then in turn, understanding how resources are allocated, that helps communities to redesign public safety so that they can better invest in systems of care instead of systems of punishment. And that may include shifting the responses to clinicians or peers, violence interrupters, and it can also include investing in basic social services like housing and behavioral health and schools.
Can I ask a little bit more on that, Liz, of who's at the table for those conversations? Who needs to be involved if you want to do that analysis?
So definitely law enforcement needs to be involved so that they can share their data. That's, at CPE, a core of the work that we do is taking data from law enforcement on things like use of force and calls for service and officer time to understand the current footprint. But then certainly above all else, we need to center the expertise and the genius of community members who've been most impacted by burdensome policing. That is the critical first step, because they know what they need and they know how the status quo is failing to meet their needs.
Yeah, and I just want to send a shout out to Wendy. She's putting a lot of amazing links in the chat for folks. We also include these in our follow-up emails. I think I was just looking at some of the comments too, and I think what's really important for us to think as we have these conversations that force us to think differently goes back to something you said earlier, Liz, about the footprint oftentimes we aren't as clear on like where are the resources actually going, like what are police responding to, what are the calls going into 911, what do the community need, and being able to do a better job of pairing and connecting those two, rather than having them be in competition with each other, when we know that when we free up police to do the things that most of us think about what is connected to the police role, which is not responding to crises, which is not responding to mental health and housing and transportation needs of the community, then we allow those, we have an opportunity to rethink how those resources can be allocated. I also wanted to touch on the fact that, most of your work includes technical assistance to communities, who want to make equitable changes to their public safety systems. Overall, policing in particular, as we mentioned before, police are at the front end of the pretrial justice system. What's your advice for localities who want to pursue 911 alternatives, or, who might just be dissatisfied with the way police are being deployed, and want to make changes? Where do they start? What are some things that they should consider as they begin to take this path?
Yeah. I think, we've talked about some great first steps already, certainly centering community members and their expertise and pairing that insight with some of the analyses that we talked about, including how and why are calls made to 911. That can really help to see if there's a disconnect between the needs and demands of the community and who is responding to those demands and needs, and can help to identify opportunities to divert calls away from law enforcement to other organizations who can better meet community needs. At CPE, we've done this kind of community-led analysis in more than 60 different localities. And shameless plug, people can learn more at our website. In particular, I would check out the work of the Triage Response Team, which is the team that I'm on, which we've done in Ithaca and St. Louis are great examples. And we like to say that we focus on improving the systems that we have while building the systems that we actually need. I would also explore CPE's Justice Navigator and our CompStat for Justice, or C4J program. These are both data-driven efforts to make policing both more equitable and less harmful. And please reach out to us for folks who want to learn more. We're also launching a new learning environment this week to support people who are seeking more equitable public safety systems. We're going to have white papers and a webinar series that integrate both public data and community insights. And the topics are going to start with traffic safety. So this will look at things like pretextual stops and financial enforcement that is really using debt as punishment, as well as some alternatives to armed enforcement. And then future papers are going to cover mental health emergencies, K through 12 education, and substance use. So a lot of great resources. Please check out our website and please reach out to us. We love to partner with jurisdictions across the country.
That's exciting, Liz. And we did put the link in the chat box as well for folks who are interested in connecting. I've noticed there have been some comments about places that are struggling with the quality of their data. And I'm sure a lot of the questions that you all are very used to and deal with all the time. So one of the things that I find particularly exciting about this topic is that there are so many examples that we can look to. Part of this series is really aspirational, and we're asking people to think in new ways and try things that haven't been done before. But in this case, there's a lot of communities that have struggled with these questions, that are figuring out solutions, that have alternatives in place, and where places that do want to explore some of these questions really can look for some examples, and probably find peers who have been there and done that, and can help with thinking through the process, as well as TA providers who have some expertise in this area. So hopefully this has planted some seeds for the folks who are in the chat box and the folks who will watch the recording. And we also appreciate the folks who are engaging in conversation in the chat about some of the challenges that you're facing, recognizing that this is not, this is not an easy fix, but it's also a complicated and persistent problem, and something that we need to be rethinking. Yeah. And one point I wanted to make sure that we highlighted, because it's come up, but we haven't said it explicitly, is that many of the civilian responder models use peer responders. So folks who have been engaged in the criminal legal system before, who have addressed some of the same issues, or are still addressing some of the same issues that are being faced by the people who are calling the system. And it's been really amazing to see some of the results of those programs, both as an opportunity to engage folks who have been impacted by the system, and recognizing that the expertise that comes from that experience is not something that we can replicate or train people for. It just comes from life. So being able to see the success of some of those programs has been really wonderful. And we did have a question in the chat box about the relative success of co-responder model versus civilian responder models. And there's not necessarily data comparing the two of them. Both of them have some really great results in terms of how they have deflected people from the formal pretrial process. But some of the question about which one is right for your community also comes down to values, as Tennille mentioned before, about, where do you think is an appropriate place for law enforcement to be? What are some of the potential unintended consequences of law enforcement involvement? And what are the benefits to those civilian responder models? So as you look through all those great resources that Wendy shared, those are some of the questions that local communities just need to be asking for themselves in terms of what's the approach that's right for you.
Yeah, I also just wanted to connect us back to the notion of public safety, and that when police are being utilized in ways that don't meet their capacities, that the individuals that are unsafe aren't just those that are coming in direct contact with law enforcement. The communities that house these individuals are now having to reap the consequences of those interactions. And by extension, just the trauma that is induced as a result of whether it's fear of police, or not being sure if you call police that the response is going to be commensurate with the call. Like, all of those things are trauma inducing. And so when we think about public safety, having limited interaction with law enforcement, but also having law enforcement responding to things that are within their capacity, really does make us all safer.
Yeah, and if I could just build on that, I think, public safety is this phrase that gets thrown around all the time, and I think it means different things to different people. And I think this goes back to our conversation about engaging communities and engaging Black and Brown and most impacted communities to really ask them what public safety means to them. I don't think that happens nearly enough in reform efforts and efforts to redesign public safety, as we like to say. So I think, talking about first steps, that's a great one. Ask people what they need to actually feel safe. And a lot of times it's not, the response is not law enforcement.
And the response is a little bit different everywhere you go. And it's usually a lot of different things that all need to be put in place. Yeah. Well, Liz, thanks so much for joining us today for this conversation. And we're really excited to have the Center for Policing Equities partnership in this work, as well as a lot of other organizations, especially those local grassroots groups that are not necessarily doing this on the national level, but are contributing to the conversation of and answering that question of what does safety mean.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the amazing work that you all do at PJI.
Thank you, Liz.
And we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you after this session. We'll be sending some follow-up resources and welcome any comments on social media that you have about this particular topic. And stay tuned in October. I can't believe that we're already talking about October, but our next session is also going to be focused on a law enforcement related topic on the expanded use of citation release and the opportunity to still avoid pretrial detention even when folks come into contact with law enforcement, but how to do that in a way that avoids racial inequities and also provides clear communication to people who come in contact with the system for what they need to do to advance their next steps.
I'm trying to keep up with the comments, but I think that someone commented just that Liz's point about less policing is important, and I think to close this out, you know, Megan, you said this before, when everything looks like looks like a nail, then you use a hammer. I'm probably saying it backwards or something. But
when you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
When you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Yes. Essentially, the point is that we need more alternatives. We need more options. And that communities can hold space for those options. And that when we have these conversations with the community, we can figure out what they need and we can support them in the response that is attuned to those needs. And so when we think public safety and we want to redesign public safety, we do have to consider that law enforcement is not a response to everything, and we can really limit the channeling through the criminal legal system for folks who don't need to have contact with it. And so this really gives us an opportunity, as Liz mentioned, to talk with the community and have conversations about how best to meet their needs.
And to have those partnerships between law enforcement and between those other public systems and community members, so that the creation of the solution and the implementation of the solution are able to be done in partnership, and ultimately the goals of all those groups are met at the end of the day. But knowing that it's a long day to be able to get that work done. But even the progress we've made just over the past few years in this area has been so heartening. And I look forward to hearing from more of you sharing your successes as well as your challenges with this work. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for joining us for this session of What If. Thanks to Neil, and thanks again to Liz.